We are now recording.
Well, I want to take the opportunity to say hello again. My name is Scott Cooksey, and those of you in the audience may have seen me before. I tend to show up a lot here at EDF, doing a lot of different events um, for various trainings. I'll be down. I'm actually planning, believe it or not, come back to the office next week and do another one of my workshops there. So hopefully keep your eyes peeled. I should be there as well. But earlier this year, I got a call that said, "Hey, we want to do a little bit more down the road of diversity and inclusion, and just have a better conversation at the company, and create some awareness and some opportunity here. And can you help us out?" And I did what any good consultant would do. I said, "Absolutely." And then I immediately reached out to my friend Jess Pettit, and Jess, who is here on the screen with us, is just a dear friend of mine. We've known each other for years. We have become colleagues through our association with the National Speakers Association, and she is the person I go to with all things diversity. She is my go-to person when I have questions about issues I don't understand, things I want to learn more about. We were having a discussion this morning before we started the call about a recent issue that has popped up that I said, I don't quite understand where this is coming from. And it turns out I didn't have the whole story. And usually that is the case. And so, as she mentioned, I'll just quickly mention, Jess, I guess you were born in Texas. I know you grew up in Plano.
Born in Fort Worth,
There you
lived in
go.
Midlothian, which was one of those towns.
Oh yeah, I know where Midlothian is.
Outside of Waxahachie, outside of Duncanville.
Yeah.
Then we moved to Plano in 4th grade, and then I fled the state.
There we go.
And
So
where
now
are
she
you
lives.
now?
Yeah, you're out west, right?
Now
California.
I'm in super, super northern California. I live 7 hours north of San Francisco on a cliff on the ocean.
That seems to suit you and your personality much better. I cannot wait to leave Texas myself.
But I'm more of a city person. It's a temperament thing, right? So I'm very fast paced.
Yeah.
So you will soon learn this. But so living in a rural area has been quite the adjustment. But sheltering in place in a spa, basically, with redwoods and mountains was not bad.
Wow. Yeah.
So
we're hijacking your intro.
No, it's fine. This is just it, right? I mean, I couldn't think of a better person to bring in to help sort of guide us through a conversation that we'll start today, and we expect this to continue for the next few months. We'll be getting together for some additional sessions in the time that is ahead. So to kind of start it, Jess, I'm going to hand it over to you. I'm kind of here to just add moral support, and I'll be part of the conversation as we move throughout. But Jess, I'm going to let you jump in, and Angela, you are absolutely invited throughout. If you have questions and would like some clarity or a perspective, I would jump right in, and I wouldn't hesitate, please. So with that, here is Jess Pettit.
Dun, dun, dun. Well, I appreciate not only Angela and Scott this opportunity, but I also want to throw out that people may be joining in at a different time. I am recording this. I'll make the recording available so people maybe will watch the recording. I feel like that's the new thing inside of this COVID time, is that we all now have a giant external hard drive of all the recordings we're never going to watch. So maybe this will be in good company. But what I like to talk about when I first start this session is kind of how I came about coming up with this series of programs. I got asked a lot of times to do a training on unconscious bias, and you may notice that unconscious bias is kind of slot 2 in the series. And the reason why was that people were showing up with their unconscious bias, positive or negative, to the unconscious bias training, and then I had to wade through that before I could get to the actual content. So I created this program called The Starting Place, was kind of a null set, right? So what I want to do is I want to be super respectful that people are entering this conversation from all different angles and places, and that's fine and dandy. So how do you have this conversation? This is what Scott and I were talking about before we got started. How do you enter a conversation with people who are entering from different places? And part of it is not really understanding how language is being used or co-opted or redefined, etc. So we're going to talk a little bit about some language, but not in a vocabulary kind of nerdy way. But then I'm also going to invite participants, those of you watching the recording and here, to also take a minute and actually really figure out like who and how you are. So then if we can do that, then we can go into next month's program on unconscious bias, because you actually took the time to figure out who and how you are. Some of us do this on a daily basis. Some of us have a therapist. So I'm saving you a copay and going to lead you through that process today.
Thank you.
You're more than welcome. Thank you very much. So with that, let me, I also want to give out a texting number. Angela, you are welcome to use this, but also people potentially watching the recording. If you have any thoughts or comments or questions, I want you to be able to ask me questions or give me scenarios, or my job is to make people think, right? And so you don't have to think within the confines of this time zone or this time frame. You can text message me at 202-670-4262. If you don't want me to read the text here, then just put DR at the beginning of the text, because then I won't read it aloud, because I don't know power dynamics. But don't put DR at the end of the text, because that is awkward. Okay. So I talked a little bit about the idea of starting place. So I've been doing diversity education for almost 20 years. I have very good skin. And in doing this, what I've realized is that there's well-intentioned people on different sides of arguments. There are also ill-intended people, but I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about well-intentioned people on different sides of the arguments who have different entry points at different vocabularies and at different access points. So you might be surprised, but that leads to some miscommunication. So that miscommunication just exacerbates the actual topic that is usually related into a misunderstanding or not knowing the whole story. So I created this so that we can truly begin to understand. So across my 20 years or so of doing this, what I have realized is that the fundamental piece that seems to be a difference, and you get to decide where are you in this, but a fundamental difference is, what are you responsible for? Are you responsible only for you? Are you responsible for more than you? And if you're responsible for more than you, how big more than you, right? So a friend of mine told me that in her Muslim faith, there is a saying that you are responsible for the 40 houses around your own. So if you live 41 houses away from me, you're on your own, except my neighbor is in charge of you, because that's how circles work, right? So 40 houses, that's what you're responsible for. We can get a little bit more, and like you may have heard of kind of the Iroquois Confederacy idea, which is 7 generations out. Some people also interpret this as 7 generations back. So that's bigger than 40 houses in the present. And there are plenty of people who are like, nope, just this house. That's it. That is all I'm responsible for. And if you have a clear understanding of where you are at in that, then it gets better, right? It's easier to have a conversation when you know what scale you are responsible for. I like to think that I act responsible 7 generations forward, 7 generations back, 40 houses around me, and my own house. I have a very high standard when it comes to what am I responsible for. Am I able to do that 100% of the time? No, there's like shit on TV to watch, right? Like, but some of the time I am actually able to lean into my own operational definition of responsibility. So I just invite you to take a second to kind of figure out, generally speaking, regardless of the topic, what is your sphere of responsibility across time, space? Has that changed and evolved across your own life with the information that you have, the different jobs that you've had, the different family roles that you've had? Has that shrunk? Has it expanded? Is it kind of an accordion and it just depends on the given day? I just want you to kind of like sit in that for a second. Now, as I go along, I will take pauses for like questions or comments or things like that. So right now, I just want you to kind of sit in what you think or what you feel is your operational definition of responsibility. So that's going to be the foundation of this conversation. I also think it's important, if let's pretend we had 300 people on this call, there could be 400 definitions with 300 people of what your own responsibility is, because we have different roles and we wear different hats, and it depends. My parents have passed away, but I understand that you have to like shift into this sandwich generation reality of at some point you are a kid, but at some point you are parenting your parents. You may also be parenting your own kids, and at some points you may also be a kid to your own kids. It just depends. So just take a second, breathe in what your foundational definition of responsibility is. You're going to take responsibility for your operational definition of responsibility, and possibly leave a little bit of room that not everybody is operating on the same definition of responsibility. Even though my brother and I were raised in Plano, Texas, with a 3-bedroom house with a yard, we did not have a fence, but we had a schnauzer, which is basically a picket fence. Our definitions of responsibility may be very, very, very different. So don't be beholden to other folks, just your definition. So with that, now we are at the starting place. This is a picture of my friend Rebecca and her son James. And it was in this moment of taking these photographs that I realized I'm not a parent. I realized that before, but I realized as not being a parent, I've never really had that different role of being a parent, of having my own children. Because my parents died when I was young, I don't have to take care of my parents, and I've had to work through my parents passing away, but also I have conversations with my parents all the time. And there's something that's around agency that I thought was really compelling when I was talking to my friend who was very excited to have her first child, and what kind of responsibilities come with being a parent. And then what kind of responsibilities does it come with being James, who hasn't hatched yet? Now James is in his 20s. But like, what of those things worked and didn't work? And it was just a fascinating starting place for me to recognize I bestow my agency often to people, and I also get really defensive and triggered when my agency gets taken away. And those things shift and change depending on situations, which I think is kind of the next step once you understand your own sense or operational definition of responsibility. Now you can kind of begin to see where that's moving forward. When we talk about what it means to be kind of in the center, sometimes I jokingly refer to people that they think they're the sun and that everything circles around them. Generally speaking, I think if you're a Scorpio, that tends to be true. But when we start talking about ethnocentrism, the idea is that those definitions, your sense of agency, your sense of responsibility is dead center. And then everything else works around it. But if we're all doing that, then we all have a different center point. So to truly engage in a conversation around diversity or unconscious bias or equity or inclusion or belonging, you need to recognize what you're centering may not be what other people are centering. That sounds super easy, but is actually why I have job security. Because even though it's easy, ain't nobody do it on a regular basis, right? Including me. But I have to be kind of reminded, all right. So when you hear these centering terms or ethnocentrism, that's basically what it's talking about, is what is at the center. I think that it's an important thing to recognize how comfortable we get with what is in the center. I make a joke all the time about a map making company in Texas, and that you can always tell when a map of the United States was made at the company that's in Texas, because Texas is dead center in the sheet of paper. But you're already making a 3-dimensional object 2-dimensional, so it's already going to be skewed. This is not a flat earther program. That is a different workshop. So to go from a 3-dimensional object to a 2-dimensional object, you're already obviously making errors. But you're going to do the best you can, right? And depict a 3-dimensional object as a 2-dimensional object. But then your perspective, in this case Texas, is almost always dead center. So that's also why it always looks so significantly bigger than the entire continent of South America, because of the skewing and the centering skewing. Make sense?
Yep.
So this is artwork by a friend of mine, Dred Scott. And what I loved about this map is this was huge up on a wall in a museum when I first saw it. I stared at this thing for 20 minutes because I couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. So I'm going to ask you, Now that you've looked at this long enough, what do you notice is missing in this picture?
Oh God, I'm so bad at geography. I have no idea. Is that Africa? I have no idea what I'm even looking at.
Totally good. So Africa is there. You can see Africa and Europe and Asia. Antarctica is down below.
Okay.
Greenland is the big thing in the top left corner. Iceland is the little guy under the I. South America is next to the A. Alaska is over by the E.
Mm-hmm.
So North America, or most of North America, isn't missing, or is missing. So for the record, Florida makes it, East Coast makes it, but the rest of North America isn't there.
Okay.
But we're often so used to looking at a map specifically from a North American lens that we have a hard time, even if you're good at geography, determining what this is a map of, because the shapes are shifted. And they're shifted from our comfort zone, our own definitions of agency, and our own definitions of responsibility. So I'm going to pause there. What are your thoughts, comments about just that?
Nothing really. I wish I knew geography better so I could get sort of the comparison here. But yeah, no, that the first part of your talk about seeing where you are and trying to figure out what you're responsible for, that part resonated with me. Sorry, this part I'm just not quite getting.
Oh, it's totally fine. It's a great example, right? So I'm a geography nerd. So to me, this was like, whoa, what is happening, right?
I see nothing here, unfortunately. If you had like a before and after, I might be able to, but I'm like that. I can't pick out countries on a map, sadly.
Totally good. You don't,
yeah.
All good. The previous photograph, because I've never been pregnant or given birth, that whole conversation was like, let me know when we're going out for lunch. Like I have no reference point, right? Yeah. And that's also fine, but it's a good thing for you to notice. Yeah. Scott, what are your thoughts? Do you have any?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I could pick up on the sort of difficult to read words at the bottom and said without America, which tipped me off, right, in the piece there. But when I look at where I know the East Coast of the United States is and I see Florida, I'm struck by how small and insignificant the size of the United States and North America as I know it pales in comparison to what is Asia, in Russia, and that which is in the center of this graph. And you know, so just thinking about that, it's like, yeah, we do tend to look at the world like every map you see, at least in the West, tends to be focused on North America and or maybe mainland Europe, but we don't see that focus of a map typically, unless it's on a globe, that really highlights places like India, Eurasia. Even Australia looks a little small on this map to me, right? And it just has to do with the, you know, Antarctica looks ginormous, so the scale is, you know, weird because it's spread out that way, but it's striking when you look at it and see that this is what the Eastern world looks like, and it's not the view we typically think of when we think of a map of the world.
Yeah. Another perspective, and I've talked to Dredd about this, is that imagine a world without America. So first off, this is a visual joke, so not everyone can even see this. Number two, some people can see it but don't know geography. Angela, thank you very much for representing that. That's great. But it is also the case that Central America and South America are America. It's just without North America. But again, we're so North America centric that we just co-opt the word America, even though that's not what we meant. And Florida's still poking out, right? Maine is still there. Nobody cares. Where is the United States? I just want to say the United States. So how we use words also defines how we perform our sense of agency and how we perform our understanding of responsibility. So this whole conversation, there is not a right or wrong way of understanding yourself. And it's not a destination, right? Like it's a journey, to use a cliche this early in the morning. So however you decide to understand yourself is how you decide to understand yourself. And some of us perform the understanding of ourself in a way that is not congruent. Okay. You do you, boo. Like, that's fine, but can you be responsible for how you do you, right? That's what we're really going to talk about. So in order to do that, we're going to need to slow down a little bit and kind of see where our responsibility, where our agency, and what we're centering in our own life, where that shows up. So that, spoiler alert, we can then notice people might be different than us. And then how do those differences impact our ability to connect with one another? So with that, any other thoughts or comments, or I'm going to move along? Thumbs up.
Good.
Okay. You may hear the words equity. Sometimes you hear the word equality. I use the word equity and inclusion. So the reason why I think it's important to have a little conversation about this. So first off, equality, generally speaking, is the idea that everybody has what I have. Equity is the idea that everybody has what they want. Now, there's a difference there, right? So I have a shoe thing. My husband would say that I have a shoe problem. It's certainly not a problem. I am quite good at acquiring shoes. I don't know that it's a problem. I have a container, and when it's a problem, we'll move and I'll have a bigger container. So I have a shoe thing. So equality related to my shoe problem would be that all of us have exactly the same shoes. So I wear a size 11. I'm not a big fan of heels. I'm actually a pretty big fan of slip-on Vans. So they're comfortable. You can off-road in them. They're great. Okay, so everyone has size 11 slip-on Vans now. That's what equality is. I think that's amazing. But not everybody likes slip-on Vans. They're wrong, but not everybody likes slip-on Vans, right? Not everybody has a size 11 shoe. So equity would be a conversation. It's often the most efficient thing to do is to slow down and have a conversation, but it's not fast, right? So when I work in the medical community, I often say a patient experience is a patient experience. So in order to have an equitable moment, you're going to have a conversation to find out, do you want shoes? If you do want shoes, what kind of shoes? Like, what's your life like? How will these shoes be helpful to you? What size of shoe would you like? Is your foot still growing, or is it still kind of handled? I don't know about anybody else, but my feet are still growing. That is annoying because I had a size 9 shoe in like 7th grade when I was 4 feet tall, and I have grown 2 shoe sizes and about a foot since then. So having that equitable conversation is actually a form of inclusion. When you're including stuff, you also have to define what you are excluding. So it is possible that you only have access to slip-on Vans or flip-flops. And if somebody doesn't want flip-flops or slip-on Vans, you're not going to be able to provide them shoes. That doesn't mean you're awful. It means that they're not included in what you have to offer. And if you know that going in, then you're not leaving someone out. You're aware that they are not included. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Giving everybody a pair of flip-flops is not good for arch support, so I don't recommend that. But you can engage in the conversation, deciding what resources you have available, recognizing what isn't going to get served, and having an individual conversation to then be able to serve the people best that you can serve. That's what equity and inclusion actually should mean and how it should be performed. So then you hear dominant identities and subordinated identities. Sometimes subordinated identities may also be called marginalized identities, silenced identities, or oppressed identities. Sticking with the foot theme, dominant identities are the privileged identities that all of us probably have at least one. We're currently employed. That is a dominant identity. Inside of a big recession, you are given magical unicorn points because you actually still have a job. So that is considered a dominant privileged identity. We might be more familiar thinking about race or gender or sexuality, religion, things like this. If our socially constructed world, and by world, I mean the thing that we center in our little bubble we feel responsible for, if our little bubble world automatically affords unicorn points because of a thing that you have that you may or may not have chosen to have. It might be genetic, and it's really whether or not it's just perceived by other people that you get the unicorn points. That would be a privileged or dominant identity. These unicorn points are not redeemable anywhere, except you know when you don't have them, more than you know when you do have them. So when you don't have them, or they're taken away, or somebody didn't know something about you, so they weren't automatically given to you, you may have experiences where like, no, I know exactly when I didn't have my unicorn points. That is a subordinated or marginalized identity or lived experience that you have. So a lot of times when I talk to, for example, straight white men, they will say like, well, I was raised poor. That is amazing. Are you still a child in poverty? Most of the men I work with are no longer a child in poverty. So then now they may have unicorn points available to them now because their economic class has improved, but they have the lived experience of being raised poor where they felt subordinated or marginalized. And they may bring some of that understanding, but they also need to be recognizing that they now have unicorn points they didn't have then. These things can kind of ebb and flow depending on perception of other people. So that's a lot of words, and my dog woke up, so it's not a ghost. That's my dog. He'll be fine. Thoughts or comments about equity, equality, inclusion, dominant or subordinate?
No, your example about your acquaintances that have grown up poor and then they suddenly got the unicorn points. Are you saying that those are not necessarily earned? It's just something that sort of comes along with going through different hierarchies throughout the society or world, and you suddenly get these magical points that put you in this different echelon?
So what's interesting about talking about unicorn points in class is earned and worth and value often get used when I get questions, which makes total sense. And I would say it depends, right? So I know that that's kind of a weird consulting answer, but like, let's take the movie Pretty Woman, shall we? I am a Gen Xer, so all movie references will be coming from when movies were still good. So in Pretty Woman, Julia Roberts is playing a character that is a lower economic class, right? Now, not because she's a sex worker or has a roommate, but her client during the movie, Richard Gere, is obviously a very, very wealthy person, right? There's a class difference between the two characters. I think we can agree on that.
Yes.
So when she's shopping, she's in a place where she is not being afforded any unicorn points. Right. Because she's not dressed appropriately. She doesn't have social capital of being in these high-end stores. So when she comes back all dressed up like Princess Diana and was like, you work on commission, right? Big mistake. Big mistake. The commission person didn't give her unicorn points. She still actually hasn't earned, I'm using air quotes, those unicorn points. But when she comes back in, she would be afforded them. And then, haha, you messed up. Make sense?
Yep.
When we move along in that movie, she is being more and more put into situations where she actually is, quote unquote, elevated to a higher economic status so that other people start giving her unicorn points. So then the drama of the movie, if you haven't seen it, I'm not going to ruin it, but I recommend it. So the drama of the movie is when she gets, quote, put back into her place, right? Because the unicorn points were taken away because somebody knew the truth about her. So unicorn points are really temporal and very dependent on the perception of other people.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, so it's a societal point you're talking about. It's almost like moving through the caste system or something. It could be caused by you, but it's what society attributes to you given where you are.
Sure. And it can work both ways, right? Like Jennifer Lopez, when she did Jenny from the Block, she's trying to say like, no, I remember where I came from. Do you really? Right? So then that goes back to perception as well. So it's fluid, it's dependent on other people, which, spoiler alert, depending on your definition of agency and responsibility, you may not really be interested in your unicorn point balance sheet being dependent on other people, but it is, whether you like it or not. And if you don't like it, it's usually because it hasn't actually been questioned in a while. Like, you can just navigate it successfully, so then you don't think you need that perception. But people who definitely need that perception are usually navigating more subordinated or marginalized experiences. Scott, it looked like you wanted to say something.
No, I'm just taking this all in. I'm keep looking at this picture trying to figure out what is the optical illusion that I'm not seeing. But
It's a foot, and the bottom of the foot is also making a face.
okay, then I'm
That's
not crazy. Okay, that's good.
No.
Thank you.
But I think it's an interesting optical illusion to go with dominant and subordinated identities because they're both are required for the illusion to work. And there's like a oppression literally involved in having or not having those unicorn points.
Yeah.
I like metaphors. I like art and I like feet. And it's early in the morning, so let me know if I can describe anything else to you. All right. So now we're going to do a little activity. So what I would encourage you all to do is get your own pen and paper, play along, etc. So we're going to use me as an example so that way y'all don't have to disclose anything you don't want to disclose. So we're going to talk about subordinated or marginalized identities that you may have, whatever they may be. Now, because of the perception role, some of these may be invisible to other people, so they may not automatically know this about you, and some of them may be visible to other people. What is also interesting about unicorn points, Angela, to your point, is that sometimes I get unicorn points I do not deserve. But I often don't correct them because I like me some unicorn points, right? I also sometimes get unicorn points taken away from me, but that's also inaccurate. So it can balance out, right? So I just picked a few identities that are about me, and then whether or not they are invisible or visible to other people. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to think about subordinated identities that you have. Now, it is possible that some of you have not spent a lot of time looking at what your subordinated identities are. And congratulations, what an excellent time to begin, right? So when you have an identity that does not automatically afford you unicorn points from other people, so you're the bottom of the foot, the privileged identities are stepping on you, right? Because you're not them. Whatever that is, if you've ever felt like an outsider or an outlier or something like this, unicorn points were taken away from you, then those are going to be the identities that you list. Then you get to determine, is that visible or is that not visible? So an example I'm going to use, and I actually, Scott, I don't know you well enough to know if you identify as more Protestant or if you identify as more Catholic. But before this call, we were talking about your church. So I know that you at least identify as a Christian, right? Yeah. So depending on where you live in the United States, if you're a Protestant, that is in the minority of Christian faith in that neighborhood. Or if you're Catholic, it could be in the minority, even though being a Christian is actually a majority faith in the United States, right? So you can do this however you want to. Mormons may identify more as Christians, but they're probably going to be more subordinated or marginalized as a religious faith unless you're living in a Mormon neighborhood. Does that make sense? So you get to pick and choose what this is, and you don't have to tell anybody. I just want you to kind of think of some.
So Jess, one of the things I'm struggling with here, right, is just want to make sure these would be things that I think of subordinated identities, things that might take away unicorn points that people could see or not see.
Sure.
Am I thinking about that through the right lens, or is there another? Okay.
No, it's, and the possible like awkwardness of it is that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about our subordinated and marginalized identities unless they are regularly part of our lives where unicorn points are taken away. So you may not have a lot of them, right? I think age is also another kind of fluid one, similar to religion. There are times where you are the old person, and there are times where you're too young to be taken seriously, and that can happen in the same day. It just depends how old you are, right? So then you get to pick and choose. So the ones that I happen to choose to make this available, and then I'm going to shut up for a little bit and let you actually come up with a list about yourself. You don't have to share it. I just want to give you some time to come up with a list for yourself. So I came up with, a social label would be sexual orientation or sexual identity. So I identify as a lesbian or queer. I don't like the word lesbian, but depending on where I am, queer is still seen as a bad word. So even though I identify as queer, I can't use it all the time in some places because it's still seen as a bad word. So I identify as not straight. That's the key. It's generally pretty visible. People usually kind of guess that I identify as a queer person. Maybe it gets confusing because my hairstylist is growing my hair out. So now all of a sudden I have hair. Normally I have hair much shorter than Scott's.
Oh, wow.
I also mentioned that I have a husband. So then sometimes people are like, what? That's not how that works. I can still identify as a queer person, but because I have longer hair now, or because I have a husband, the unicorn points might get taken away, or given to me, wrong way, because I might be assumed to be heterosexual, right? But generally speaking, I'm a white lady doing diversity work. Usually people assume that I must be somehow not straight. So I put a little X invisible. That doesn't mean I'm right. That's just what it feels like to me. I don't identify as a Christian. I was raised in North Texas by two atheist parents, both of which were raised super Baptist. So it's like a secret that I was raised an atheist because everyone just assumes I'm a Christian because I'm not celebrating any high holidays this particular weekend. I don't wear any hats, but they just generally assume. And Christianity is so pervasive, I know the words to every Christmas song, whether I like it or not. So it's invisible how I actually identify, but I benefit from the assumption that I'm a Christian. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So it's subordinated that I don't identify as a Christian, even though I actually do often get the assumption that I'm Christian. Physical ability issues. I have a lot of physical limitations. I also hate asking people for help. So I design my entire life around not having to ask people for help. So if I have to take a stairs or something at a particular location, that might be the only time it really comes up. Otherwise, I will work very, very hard for you to never know that I have physical limitations. So they are invisible and then usually don't impact my unicorn points. When it comes up, though, what often happens is the other person is like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. And they get really defensive. Yeah, I was hiding it from you because I don't want you to have an idea. But no, I am not walking up 8 flights of stairs because the elevator's broken. So then we have to have that conversation, right? I also identify as a woman. That tends to be pretty visible, right? Especially since my hairstylist started growing my hair out. I haven't been he'd or himmed in public in a while. I haven't been asked why am I in a woman's bathroom in a while. And again, the only thing that's changed is I've grew my hair out. But when I had shorter hair, I very frequently got called to, like, why are you in this bathroom? And then I would turn around, people would see that I have boobs, and then they'd be like, oh, okay, never mind, sorry. But then they're all defensive again. So that's just a little about me. So what I would like for you to do is to just try to come up with 2 or 3 subordinated or marginalized identities. Write them down on your own side. Again, you don't have to share them. And whether or not you think that this is invisible to other people or you think that this is visible to other people, doesn't matter. You don't have to share them. I just want to give you some time to think about it. And then after we do this, we'll go to dominant identities. So I'm going to mute, have some water, and let you do this. So, go for it. Again, you have full permission to kind of struggle with this because sometimes people don't often spend a lot of time thinking about this.
Jess, I came up with 2 and I had to sort of struggle to find those. And that I was aware of. I'm sure there are plenty of others, but those are the ones. I mean, I struggled to come up with 2. You're right. It's not not something that I always think about, or I'm wondering how many of these things, like I crossed a couple of things out that probably are going to fall under the other category.
Dominant.
The dominant thing, but they might be seen as a more unicorn. I don't know. It just, I don't know. This is an interesting exercise. It makes you think.
Yeah. Well, and I would say, like, Angela, if you don't mind, Scott, in our world as speakers and consultants, one of the things that I'm hearing now is male, stale, pale, and frail. And that men, white men specifically, who have gotten consulting gigs or speaking gigs, all of a sudden are losing them to other people. And they're being told that they're not being selected because they can't have another manel, right, wherever all the panelists are men. Because over the last couple of years, there has been kind of an awakening that there is a pattern that a lot of the speakers and consultants that are hired are white men, and that needs to be diversified, right? So people who don't identify that way have been like, yeah, we've been saying that for a very long time, but good for you. But for my white men friends, it's the first time they've ever felt objectified, right? Like I think my experience with my friends is that they thought they were being hired for their content, but they were being hired for their content because they weren't objectified. Whereas people with a lot of visible subordinated identities are often hired as objects that might have content.
Well, right? Let's be honest. I mentioned at the top of our time here today, Jess, one of the reasons I reached out to you was I didn't feel as a, white, middle-aged male, tall guy that I was the best person to stand up and say, let's talk about diversity.
And I guarantee you there are some people who are like, what does this white woman know about diversity? But the truth is that if we were doing this work from our dominant identities, then we wouldn't be putting the labor on all of the subordinated marginalized folks to be doing this lifting, primarily educating those with dominant identities, right? So it can be hard, but again, remember the baseline here is responsibility and agency. So like I had a call with someone this morning about the thing that we were talking about before, and a friend of mine has been a member of this association for 7 years and is like, ugh, I haven't seen the needle move, I'm out. And I'm like, okay. And you have no visible subordinated identities and you're tired after 7 years. Like, use it as a moment to just imagine what it would be like for, like, list your subordinated identities and you'd be mad that I'm talking again because you're not done. You are rattling them off. Why is she talking? I'm not done yet. There are people who exist in that world, right? So just notice you're nailing it and you're doing it great. And not everybody has this experience. Yeah. That's really it. Angela, were you going to say something?
No, sorry. I was just doing exactly what you were saying, still writing while you were talking.
Perfect. Okay, great. So we're going to move to dominant ones. You can always go back if you need to. Oh, my mouse is not waking up. That is an Excel document. Okay. Go, mouse, cooperate. Okay, so dominant identities, these are the ones that I am consciously receiving unicorn points for, right? Now, some of them may be invisible and some of them may be visible. So I want you to do another list. So I'm going to go through me again. And then I'll shut up, have some more water, and y'all do your dominant identities. Then, Scott, to your point, I want you to notice if this is easier or harder than the other list. Spoiler alert, sometimes this one's also hard because we haven't spent any time thinking about it. And sometimes you're like, oh, I got this one. I took a class. I read a book, right? So sometimes this one might be easier. For people who are very familiar with their subordinated and marginalized identities, this is often very hard because they have to really sit in what it means to be a Christian or what it means to be heterosexual or what it means to be able-bodied. And they're used to doing work around their subordinated identities. Okay, so I identify as a white person. That is pretty visible, right? I identify as a U.S. citizen. Technically speaking, that's invisible unless I'm walking around with my passport. But what's fun is it gets smushed together, conflated together, and is assumed when people hear me speaking English, I sound like a native English speaker, therefore I must be a US citizen. That's not actually how that works, but we don't care. That's just what it sounds like, and we're just doling out unicorn points, right? It is also assumed I'm at least upper middle class, which also goes to language use and how I use English. It's assumed that I'm highly educated. You don't know that I'm highly educated other than how I'm using English. And I'm leading this training, and how I'm leading this training, maybe you think I've like been to college or something. So highly educated, upper middle class, native English speaker, US citizen kind of gets smooched together. I mentioned age, so I'm almost 50, again, good skin, and a Zoom filter that fixes your face, right? That also helps. But most people don't think I'm that old. So there are times where I'm in spaces where they think I actually got carded for cigarettes last year. I wrote that down. My friend, inside COVID, it was my month to go grocery shopping, and I got carded for cigarettes. I was so excited. So excited. In the state of California, that means they didn't know if I was 18. Now, granted, I was wearing a mask, but sometimes masks are good for things, right? There are other spaces where when I come in as a consultant, usually a board table is like, who is this 20-year-old Yahoo? And then I blow them away because I have 30 more years experience than they gave me credit for. There are also times where I'm in a texting thread where I shared a TikTok the other day because someone called Nirvana golden oldies.
Oh.
And I was not good with that. So I
just died a little bit. Thanks.
Yeah. I shared it on this texting thread, and half of the women in the texting thread didn't know who Nirvana was.
Oh my gosh.
I don't know how the world is doing, but age is one of those examples that can be unicorn points, cannot be unicorn points. Sorry to make fun of you if you don't know who Nirvana is. I would highly suggest looking it up. Okay. Because grunge was like 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Sure, we'll go with that.
This is why Gen Xers are bitter, is because that's my dog telling me that the mail is here. Yeah, that's gonna happen. Hold on one second.
Uh-oh. Somebody's getting the business.
It's getting real.
So sorry. And in the world of Zoom, like that hasn't happened to every single person in the whole wide world.
Yeah.
Okay.
Jess, now knowing that you have, I mean, I knew you had dogs before, but now that there's proof that wasn't something you made up, you get extra unicorn points with me.
Oh, excellent. And see, if you're a cat person, I would lose them.
Yeah, we have a cat that lives here, but I'd rather have a dog.
I have 3 dogs, and I would rather have a cat.
Oh.
Anyway, so there we go. So there's some of my dominant identities. Now, I am also legally married, and I was legally married before gay marriage was legal, right? So then some people are like, wait, I'm now confused about the other thing. Notice that you're deciding whether to give or not give me unicorn points. Either way, I don't care. I'm in love and happy. So keep them, give them, sounds great. I am also a flaming extrovert. That is very visible, if not auditorily available. But it is also very much rewarded in what we call engagement, or how we interact with each other, right? Is that I talk, I ask questions, I'd be active in a chat, or something like that. So that's usually rewarded. So that gives me unicorn points. It is also super annoying because I talk a lot. And after sheltering in place with an introvert, I'm very aware of the bonus of the man cave in the backyard because we're both alive. So with that, sorry the mail didn't come right now because that would have been handy. I'm going to mute. I want you to spend some time thinking about what are all your dominant identities, what are visible, what are invisible, and just make yourself a little chart and see how that's working for you. And then we're going to come back and then talk about, you don't have to share what you put on it, but I want to share which list was easier or harder. Were they both easy? Were they both hard? Just take a second to kind of get to know yourself. Sound good?
Can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
On your almost 50, were you writing that just because I'm also almost 50, and I would actually see that as a subordinate trait? Were you saying it's because you get away with looking younger, or do you think that being almost 50 actually is dominant? Because I'm just sort of curious why you stuck that there.
So I put it in dominant identities because I don't think, even though the cigarette story is true, I don't think most people assume I'm in my 20s anymore. So I think, I mean, maybe because I'm hired or brought in as a consultant, that I'm at least an expert of something.
Okay.
So I feel like I'm taken more seriously. Now, I distinctly remember the turning point of where it was like, oh, cute, go get me coffee, to all of a sudden, like, well, Jessica, what do you think? Right. And it was literally, I was serving on a board. And one day I stated point of order because the president wasn't following Robert's Rules of Order and was ignoring people who were in the queue. So I said, point of order, blah, blah, blah. And the table, like the room shifted. I was the only woman in the room. And the table shifted because I was right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And 10 minutes before, I was fetching people coffee, at least in their head. Don't
Yeah.
ever ask me to fetch you coffee because it's going to scald you. But in their heads, I was still in like pull boy, right? But I was correct. I did it correctly. And I advocated for some of the men in the room who had comments that were being overlooked.
Mm-hmm.
So then all of a sudden, I got age and experience points.
Yes. Okay.
And I
Okay.
kind of never let them go away.
No. Okay, that makes sense. Yes. And here, being in Texas, it's probably palpable going both ways, especially as a female lawyer that's almost 50. You definitely get more points for people knowing you know your shit by that point. But then also, there's the 20-year-olds walking around the office who are seen as sort of in a different class than you are. Like I'm definitely going the other way on some categories with unicorn points, and then also going. So I was just curious as to what you meant by that and how you
Yeah,
would.
it depends. And I would say that sometimes, and we're getting a little advanced here, but I think sometimes also the unicorn point battle can also happen in group, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
like, if you're surrounded by a bunch of 50-year-old lawyers and you're surrounded by a bunch of 20-year-old lawyers, that's going to create an us and them. We'll talk about that in a second. But you might get more points with your peers and lose points with your 20-year-olds unless you're the cool 50-year-old, and then you're going to get more points with the 20-year-olds and lose points with the 50-year-olds.
Makes sense. Yeah. Yeah.
It
Okay.
actually makes no sense, but it happens. So yeah.
It doesn't make sense that it happens, but it makes sense because I mean we all do it.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Which really brings up the point of how completely superficial power and privilege is.
Yes.
Which is why it's really fascinating when we don't really sit with what is our definition of responsibility and agency. People can get really defensive
Mm-hmm.
about
Mm-hmm.
this, but like we're talking about something as subjective as what you just named. So what are you defensive about, friend?
Yeah.
Like, I'm super confused. But what I have found is that the defensiveness is coming from this kind of misunderstanding of vocabulary
Mm-hmm.
and the instant defense of having done something wrong without knowing what you have done wrong. Well, of course you're going to be defensive. You don't even know what you did wrong.
Right.
So let's back up and talk about some of this stuff so then we can talk about that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Cool?
Yep. Yep.
Okay, I'm going to mute.
Okay.
The dog wants back in. I believe the mail has arrived. We are not under nuclear attack. And then we'll pick back up.
Okay.
Okay? So come up with your lists. All right, Angela is still working.
I think I'm good.
All right. Scott, how are you doing?
Good.
Excellent. So you don't have to disclose anything that you don't want to, but I'm curious, don't compare yet, but just what was it like listing out your dominant identities?
I'd like to say it was eye-opening, but I don't think it was. I think these are things that I know to be true, and why things are the way that they are in the world. But it was a good exercise to actually think about it and, write it down.
Mm-hmm. Scott, do you have any thoughts or comments?
The dominant list certainly was easier for me to come up with, although I found there were a couple of categories that kind of fell into that. It depends on the context as whether that might be a dominant or a subordinated issue. Like, is it a plus or a minus? I'd say it depends. And I think it's influenced by what reality you're in. And I mean, I can share what that example was that just came to mind is just political leaning, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of what I believe is the way that I carry myself, that shows up, that on one hand shows up as being fairly tolerant, and in another place it's surprising that a guy from Oklahoma would say some of the things that I do that would be inconsistent with what seems to be the louder voice in this state.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
I mean, I'm in a very red state, and my political views are not that way.
Yeah.
But I also see fault in, deeply blue conversations as well, right? So I'm more of that bluish purple, I think, is probably where I land if you were going to put a color label on it.
Sure.
And I think in some circles that's a plus for me, and in other circles it might take away some points with a few people, and
Yep.
I'm okay with that. I don't really care, but
And
some people do.
It's an excellent example of the difference between access and perception, right? So this is usually the point where I kind of talk about this too. So like perception, I'm generalizing, but perception is like, are people going to be nice to me or are people not going to be nice to me? Right? That's about it. Access is you just filled up your tank and you forgot your wallet. Are you going to jail or do you get to go home and get your wallet?
Interesting.
Those are very different realities for people, and some of it has to do with social capital. But if we just strip it down to dominant or subordinated identities, chances are the three of us would be able to like leave a Post-it note, go get our wallets, and come right back. Right? Because I'm guessing, based on economic class, I'm guessing on what kind of car we drive. Right? I'm also guessing on how we're going to be perceived by a gas station attendant. So it's a different job persona, right? And the social skills of what it even means to practice advocating for yourself. I am a very good salesman when I need to win. And so it's very hard for someone to say, no, that doesn't work to me, because I can actually be quite good at persuading people to do things for me. Some of that would call that being a white woman. Some of it would call being a white woman who's a professional speaker, who's very well educated or whatever. But I also think that I can perform, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Like take my dog and my Cholula packets from the center console of my car that I cherish with my life, and I'll be right back. Like I could do that, or I could leave my cell phone as collateral, right? Well, my cell phone itself is worth almost the price of a tank of gas now, right? Like, but that's just because gas prices are really expensive.
Yeah.
We have the luxury of doing that. And when we talk about luxury, that's the capital of unicorn points. And that's very different than perception, right? So I encourage you, when you have the ones that are hard to decide,
Yeah.
Will this get me a bigger loan from the bank? Or would this get me a smaller loan from the bank? Would I be allowed to enter a bank? If I entered a bank, would I be followed by security? Am I on the board of the bank? Right? Like those are kind of things to play, and that'll help you figure out Is this actually a subordinated or marginalized experience or not? Because we'll get to kind of what, Scott, what you're also talking about is minority majority stuff, which literally is more math based than power and privilege based.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Okay.
Other thoughts or comments?
I did find it funny that I could identify as being both married and divorced because I've had both experiences.
Yep.
And I'm currently married. That's very visible, but a lot of people don't know that I was previously married and have been divorced from someone else. So, and that changes perception of some people. Like in some conversations, it's interesting how people will be like, "Oh, I didn't know you were married before," and it's all of a sudden it's this person knows or understands something differently, or at least they give me points for that or don't. Right? I guess it depends. They're like, "Oh, well, what's wrong with you?" And I'm like, "Nothing. Just
Right.
didn't want to be married to somebody who didn't want to be married to me." So it's like, all right. But it took
And
me a long time to get there.
right. And even playing out those things, again, when you're defining responsibility and agency for yourself,
Yeah.
as a man who says you're divorced, I would imagine that that also comes with you must have cheated.
Mm,
So then when you say, well, she didn't want to be married to me anymore, what did you do? Right? Like, where
I hadn't
is
thought
that
about that,
coming
but
from?
yeah.
Right? And without doing personal therapy on you, it is possible you did nothing wrong and this wasn't a choice you had and it occurred in your life. Same thing goes when people disclose whether or not they're survivors or veterans or
Mm,
have had a miscarriage or an abortion. These are not things that people know about us.
right.
But once they do know about us, it comes with a story that may or may not be accurate.
Or it may change the perception someone has of us in some way.
Right.
Yeah.
Try being this in this package and telling people I'm from Texas. What?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so if we've done that little reflective activity, before we get to the power and privilege piece, I want to. Scott put a reminder in the chat that I don't know if it'll show up in the recording, so I'm just going to voice it for the recording. Yep. But anybody can text message me at any time, 202-670-4262. EDF at the beginning of the text will let me know that it's from this particular client, and then I'm happy to text you back. If you are watching the recording, I really recommend, because you probably didn't, put pause, go back, and actually map out some of your subordinated marginalized identities and whether they're visible or invisible, and map out some of your dominant identities and whether they're visible or invisible. It's an interesting activity that's actually, it should be so easy because no one else knows these answers other than you, but we often outsource it or don't do this to ourselves. So just take some time. So once you have done that, now we can have the conversation about power and privilege. So, and again, talking about where all the defensiveness comes from, what I find is that it is an assumption that there is a zero-sum game and that power and privilege only exists in one jar. And so some people get a scoop, some people get this scoop, some people get double scoops, and then all of a sudden you're out. We created the system so we can create the definitions and the applications of power and privilege. It is not necessarily a zero-sum game because we invented the game. So what I like about this particular picture is when a lot of times we use the word majority or minority. So Scott, to your point, you live in Oklahoma, which is a red state. You're more of a kind of purpley, bluish, maybe political standing in a red state. So what does that mean? So I'm not going to get into like gerrymandering and voting access, etc., although that is a different workshop I am happy to lead. Yeah. But what is interesting is that the most numbers don't necessarily have the most power. Oftentimes, like let's just take wealth, we'll stay on that kind of track. The 1% of the globe, 1% of the population has like 88% of the wealth on the globe. That is a few very wealthy people. So then everybody else isn't that wealthy and is sharing the 20 some odd % of the resources that are available. That's not equitable. That's not evenly distributed, right? Now, some people would immediately say like, socialism, equally distributing everything. This is a different workshop as well, but recognizing how power and privilege don't mathematically balance out is really important when thinking about your own agency and your own sense of responsibility. So what I like about this picture is to think about an opportunity. And are you the person that has the opportunity to give away? Or are you the person who's waiting for the opportunity, or demanding the opportunity, or earning the opportunity? Either way, those three folks are on the same side of this door. And then there's the other people who have the opportunity to give away. They can pick and choose who's going to get this little resource or get this opportunity. So when you look at this picture, are the two people on the right opening the door or closing the door? And is the mass of people on the left of the picture waiting for the door to open, demanding that the door open? Are they waiting on something, or are they just arriving at something? And why this is important is we don't know. I didn't take this photograph. But when we talk about power and privilege, we absolutely know what is happening in this photograph. And that's a really important thing to understand. There are times you are on the left side of the fence. There are times you are on the right side of the fence. And what my suggestion or my approach to this work is that a lot of times we are organizing from the left side of the fence. And I'm not saying that's bad, but if you're organizing from the left side of the fence, ultimately someone's going to have to open the door. If we could organize from the right side of this picture, then the cost, the risk is so much less. So Scott, to use you as an example, as a purple person in a red state, it's so much more powerful for you to advocate for purple things in a red state than it is for you to advocate for purple things in a blue state. If you're shooting for purple things, right?
Yeah,
so I moved to the West Coast, and I'm like the most conservative person I know now.
Wow.
Right? That's a lot, right? My very first boss in Oregon used to cancel staff meetings because the tea leaves said it was a bad day to gather.
Wow.
What? I got a deadline. What are you talking about? Whatever. I had to learn, and I had to adjust to where I was at. Right? So when you think about your dominant identities, that's when you're on the right side of the fence. And when you think about your subordinated or marginalized identities, if you have any, you're probably on the right side of the fence. But the reality is that you are actually on both sides of the fence all of the time. Because of intersectionality, all of these things are intersecting. All of your life happens simultaneously. Mm-hmm. So it's not in these clean departments, but you can think about yourself when you're in those particular departments, when you are receiving, losing, giving, or taking unicorn points. I want you to think about this picture. Thoughts or comments about that?
It's a great perspective.
I really love this picture. Okay, so usually around this point is when we either start getting a little like, this is a lot of time on myself, so I'm going to flip and focus onto some annoying person. So you want to name this really problematic person. Whoever the problematic person they are is like, as long as you're not them, you're doing fine. Right? So like, this is why I watch Hoarders, because I feel very unclean and disorganized, but like, I've never lost a toothbrush under a carcass. I'm fine. Right? I might be a little behind in laundry, but like, I'm doing okay. So we compare ourselves, and as long as we're not as bad as this person, as long as we're not this, then we're fine. Mm-hmm. That's comforting, but that's also not dismantling a system that you just said you wanted to dismantle. So when we worry about them over there, what we're doing is creating an us and them dynamic. And us and them dynamics are around right and wrong, winning and losing. So the right people are the us. But my us is your them, because that's how grammar works, right? So this is futile, but we are very comfortable with this. But them over there, they're wrong. They're totally wrong, and that makes me more right. So if them are wrong and us are right, then I feel correct. So I don't actually have to do anything different. But they're saying the same thing. So now we're back to the fence. And if we're going to do something different, we can't just us and them ourselves the whole time. So Scott and I keep referencing this thing that happened in a Facebook group. That's all we really need to say, isn't it? Something happened in a Facebook group.
Yeah.
And one of the
Insert your
things,
favorite Facebook topic here, and you've probably had a very similar conversation, regardless of what Facebook groups one might be a part of.
right, exactly. So I come in with a splitting the difference in the middle. It is not a middle of the road statement. I am very aware of what harm is happening. I'm very aware of how free speech works. I'm very aware of these things. And here is where we're at. So then I have this happening, I have this happening, I have this explosion. I woke up to like 300 text messages this morning because people are so deeply rooted in us and them, and feeling like this is an act of violence in the face of someone sharing an actual act of violence, and they're just digging their heels in.
Mhm.
Quote, both sides do this. So
Mhm.
stop. Just stop doing that. It's not effective. If we want to call that person a donkey, there's some editing there, right? So I'm going to call them a donkey. The truth is that we're all doing this. So it's an excellent opportunity for, when do you fly off the cuff? When are you getting hot under the collar? When are you cannot hear any nuance. It's just a hard no. Whenever those things are, they can stay and you're responsible for them. Some of them you might want to examine if you have to be responsible for it. So I think that's an important thing to understand, right? Is that we want to call names, but we do the same behaviors, regardless of what side of things you are on. So how things are happening doesn't help. Differently right gives you an opportunity to actually notice if there's something different to do or something different to be said. So I think it's important to talk about like the outbound messages that you're giving and how you are perceived by someone else doesn't necessarily align. And you're not entitled to that alignment. You actually have no control over how people perceive you. And often we haven't even done our own work to really identify who we are. We just get mad at being perceived wrongly, but we're not even really sure what is rightly. So that's why doing our own work really matters. So I like to use this example because it's incredibly polarizing and makes people really panic. Oh gosh, she's going to talk about Western expansion. Here I am. So take me to your leader, right? Take me to your leader. So I'm going to generalize real fast U.S. history. So a boat of primarily white, Puritan, Christian exiles land erroneously in a place thinking they're going to be the only people there because they're entitled to their space. They're not the only people there. So when they show up from a matriarchal or patriarchal society, even though there's a queen, patriarchal society, they show up, they meet new people, and they say, take me to your leader. And all these women show up. And they're like, oh, those are the cheerleaders. Uh-huh, cute. Thank you for the welcome wagon. Please take me to your leader. So then eventually the women stop coming and men start coming. I think that this is when they got downgraded, because the actual Native Americans or indigenous tribes that are still alive, because it was a failed attempt at genocide, the still alive Native folks who were on the eastern coast were matriarchal societies, are matriarchal societies. So they sent women because the women were like, who are you? Right? Because that's their job. They weren't getting any headway. So they sent actual scouts to be like, what's happening here? What's going on? But because of the different worldviews, what ended up happening was the Europeans who came actually thought that they were making agreements with people who were in charge. Not that they had any intention of actually honoring those agreements, but they thought they would at least be talking to the leaders. Now, not to throw any indigenous folks under the bus, but there was also a misunderstanding there as well. And that is the agreements. You can't own land when the land itself is one of your gods and you actually respect the land as a community member. So by owning the land, it was permission to share resources. There ain't nothing about sharing that was coming over on a boat from Western Europe. Sharing is not a concept. So not understanding sharing and not understanding matriarchal leadership really set this up for disaster when it actually started with the entitlement of being the first ones there in the first place. I believe this similarity is why most organizations give me job security, because we're working with very different understandings, very different assumptions, and very different definitions of words that we are then getting into agreements that don't make any sense. And the reason why they don't make any sense is because we haven't stopped to actually acknowledge our own definitions and then check in and see if the operational definitions on the other side of the conversation are similar or how they are different. If we had done that, chances are we would still probably have like absolutely not honored any of our agreements, because that's kind of like what we do culturally. But we can do that with the unicorn points because we're on the right side of the fence. Thoughts, comments on that very abridged version of U.S. history? Good?
That's about the most precise encapsulation of a whole host of very complicated issues broken down in a way that people can get it. I'd say that definitely makes you an expert in this field, Jess.
Thank you. I'm also a history nerd. Okay. So with that moving forward, now we're approaching the now what, right? So now we have actually devolved cultural expectations into symbols that we think we all agree on. So I use bathroom signs as an example because if Western expansion wasn't controversial enough, let's talk about bathrooms, shall we? So I have never seen a stick figure in a bathroom, nor have I seen a stick figure wearing a cape in a bathroom. But somehow there is a universal understanding of what is happening inside of a bathroom, and it is policed by people who do not look like stick figures or stick figures wearing capes. But it's culturally normed. And then when someone says, actually, you're wrong, I'm actually in the right place, then all hell breaks loose. Because our assumptions are based on symbols that are based on words that we actually don't have agreed upon definitions. Generally speaking, people assume that people are in the bathroom that they are intending to be in. But we can legislate out here using words and paper about our worst fears that could possibly happen in a bathroom space. But when we're doing that, I recognize there's a lawyer on the call, but when we are doing that, we are actually not acknowledging that, like, most of us have a gender neutral bathroom in our house. Is the door closed? Someone's in there. Is the door open? Come on in, right? Like my brother and I shared a bathroom, and depending on what we were doing in the bathroom, depended on whether or not the door was open. If I'm brushing my teeth, you can come in and brush your teeth. If I'm doing something else, I'm going to shut the door. We can navigate this. We have the social skills to navigate this in our own homes, but we're projecting fear and danger out to other folks, which is actually making it so that people cannot go to the bathroom in public safely. And the people who are actually conducting the most violence are actually women in the women's bathroom. Women are actually leading to death and long-term disabilities by policing what is allowed to be in the women's bathroom under the guise of protecting a woman's space. Fascinating is that we are actually making the women's space violent and then blaming it on men. That's not actually how it works. If we can notice what we are doing and what land or spaces we feel entitled to and how we are policing it, if we understand where our agency and our responsibility comes from, we might be able to let people pee in peace. That's a thing. So I want to throw that out there. Now, in doing so, when we start talking about entitlement, this is actually a tattoo I have on my arm as a reminder to slow down. Because I think I know how many legs an elephant has. I am fairly certain I know how many elephants exist with 4 legs. I'm going to say the vast majority of them. We could get into like poaching injuries and stuff, but that's not what I mean. But when I look at this image, how many legs does this elephant have? What can end up happening is we start getting confused. Kind of like the map, right? Angela, you said you're not very good at geography, so you're looking at that map and you're like, oh my gosh, what is going on? I don't even know what's happening. The artist, MC Escher, drew this picture to be confusing. And then what happens is we look at it and we feel entitled to the answer. Yeah, it's art. But art literally is in the eye of the beholder, much like your own definitions of responsibility and agency are. So, how is that landing? How are you doing out there? Thoughts, comments?
No, interesting.
What's remarkable to me is, when you gave the example just prior to sharing this slide about the restroom thing, and let's keep a Gen X reference here, thinking about the TV show Ally McBeal. Like how controversial it was on that show that they had a comedy show but it had a gender neutral, I mean, it basically had a unisex bathroom. The men and the women used the same restroom, and it became a point of comedy and connection, right? Rather than this thing that was awkward and like indefensible or like something to be angry over. It was just like, we're just people. And that was kind of the point, right, of having that in the show. But it's interesting how that message, I think there are some folks perhaps of that same generation that get that and they're like, okay, it's a bathroom, big deal. Like, it's a bathroom. And there are others that turn that into a very different. So again, it comes back to what was that experience, right? I mean, I remember as a young professional talking to other young professionals going, that would be hilarious if we had that kind of setup here at the office. And others were like, no. It's just interesting.
Yeah, there's real world applications, right? So, like one of my consulting clients, they made a lactation station available at work to be inclusive of people who were lactating and needed to pump breast milk.
Hmm.
Okay, great. Sounds amazing. So, what's interesting is that they used the office internal calendar to reserve the lactation station because they didn't want to just let people willy nilly go use the lactation station because, heaven forbid, what would they be doing in there? Right? Now, that's the control freak issue, and that's why I was there. But they used this internal office calendar. So, using the internal office calendar meant that anyone in the office knew that somebody was in the lactation station at any point in time. I have never breastfed. You're welcome. But my understanding is that this is relatively a culturally private thing.
Mm-hmm.
And you're at work. You're not even supposed to talk about boobs at work, right? Unless you're a mammogram clinic. And then you probably have some questionable ways that you can talk about boobs. But at a lactation station, at an accounting firm, you're not supposed to talk about boobs, but there's now an online calendar of when Tamara is doing stuff with her boobs. So all the women were like, no, you can't do this. You can't call it the lactation station. You can't do this. You can't do this. What do you want us to call it? Let's call it the mother's room. So then all the fathers were like, well, where's my room? So the rest of the world was like, all of the other rooms on the planet are your rooms, right? So this is not helping, right? And if we want to get complicated, not all mothers breastfeed. Do they still get to use the room? And some fathers do breastfeed because that's how the world works. So now all of a sudden they were like, we're just trying to do a good thing. So they ended up, the threat was to remove the lactation station altogether. We tried to do a nice thing. We just can't have nice things. How about we just have a conversation? What do people feel entitled to? What is actually happening in the space? Why do you need to micromanage what someone does in a small room where they get to be private? Right? Like, I used to be a very heavy smoker. I don't miss smoking, but what I miss is a culturally acceptable reason to go away for 7 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
I miss that so much. I'll be right back. Oh, she's gonna go smoke. I go smoke. Now, I didn't have a cell phone then, but it was like silent. I got to go into a scary alley with like rodents and grease pits and chain smoke while I was waiting tables. And it was totally acceptable. Everyone just covered my station until I got back. And then I had their back when they went out for a smoke break. Right? Mm-hmm. We are capable of doing this. But because we are sensitive and we're not operating with the same definitions of things and we feel entitled to stuff, I have job security. I don't have to have job security. Just be nice to each other. That's all you have to do. No, thank you, ma'am. We'll hire you instead. All right. When we start talking about what this means, when we get into beliefs and thoughts and words and actions and habits and values, what is so amazing is we quote Gandhi without actually knowing that Gandhi was a disaster, very challenging person to work with, who was assassinated by his own co-workers. Don't be like that. But we also really objectify this romantic notion of beliefs and thoughts and words and actions and habits and values. But we don't actually know what ours are. We personify organizations and give them human rights, but the organization also has beliefs and thoughts and words and actions and habits and values. What are those? What are you doing currently that is incongruent with those values? I guarantee you a lot of things. So what can you do to become more congruent? And usually it starts with recognizing what your own operational definition of responsibility and agency is. So, you may be familiar with the Golden Rule. Something similar to this is available in almost every religious faith. And basically, the idea is be nice to people the way you think nice means, right? So, be nice the way you want to be treated. Um, what is fascinating about worldview is that it's not always the same definition. So, it's timely to do this in Texas. This is my friend, Dan Mitchell, and Dan Mitchell Jr. I happened to be there when Dan Mitchell Jr. was born. Dan Mitchell Sr., the very first thing that he said when he held his son is, "I cannot wait to take you to a University of Texas football game." That is a lot of pressure to put on an infant. And because karma, I'd like to point out that Dan Mitchell Jr. graduated with honors valedictorian from Texas A&M. Those of you that are from Texas know this is a very big deal.
That's a very big deal.
Yes. Now, I have to admit, full disclosure, my mother was an Aggie. My dad was a Longhorn. I went to college out of state because this is a very big deal. At the root of your worldview should be your values. So I'm using this as an example that Dan Mitchell Sr. loves his son and somehow figured out a way to pay tuition to Texas A&M. And the how was largely, one, almost a full ride scholarship, and two, is that it was about his son and not about his worldview related to UT. His worldview was about love. Now, I know I live in California and I'm invoking football, and that was very touchy-feely. But worldview is yours. When you put all of this together, it's your worldview. This is the center of your map. But it doesn't mean it's other people's maps. This is your responsibility. This is your agency. This is all of your identities. This is what you feel entitled to. This is what you don't know about. This is your worldview. And the choices that you can make from this worldview sometimes will be congruent. And sometimes will lead you going to a Texas A&M dad alumni event, which he wears his Longhorn hats to. Okay? That's what matters. As you are growing and thinking back over your life taught you how to be, just like my life taught me how to be. Our lived experience taught us who and how we are going to be in the world. And if we don't take responsibility for that, we're not doing anything. In the 1900s, when I was in college, this was called pluralism. Then it was called multiculturalism. Then it was called tolerance. Right? What's weird about tolerance is I actually expect more than tolerance. Unless you don't tolerate me, then we can start there. Then we can get to awareness. Then we can get to celebration. That was a little loud. So then we got to diversity. Then we got to social justice. And then Glenn Beck screwed that up for a lot of people. And now we're calling it equity and inclusion. You may hear belonging. The point is that there is a fire. And we can possibly do something correct about the fire. Or we can mow the lawn. And most of us are mowing the lawn because we don't actually know what the correct thing to do is. So then that's when I say picking up a garden hose may not put the whole fire out, but at least is the correct activity. Being reflective and responsible for yourself is probably not going to dismantle all systems of oppression on the globe. But it is the correct thing to do. It is actually the starting place. And that's when you know how to take a stand, what to say or what to listen to, and what you're going to do. Because you've actually taken responsibility for who and how you are in the world, and fly your freak flag. Be a weirdo. That is completely fine, but know how you're being your own weirdo and be responsible for your own weirdoness, and then allow some space for other people to be a weirdo. That is actually inclusion. I believe that we are doing the best we can with what we have some of the time. That is a pretty low bar. Do the best you can with what you've got some of the time. But ultimately, that's what noticing means. It means that you're going to take responsibility for yourself. You're going to notice some things in other people. You're going to pay attention. You're going to do the best you can with what you've got some of the time. Because that's what responsibility means. That's what agency means. And hopefully in the time we've spent together today, this is enough of a foundation that when we start now talking about unconscious bias and what to do and how to be an ally or how to be an advocate or what else we need to know or how to broaden our perspectives or how do we find out what we don't even know we don't know? How do we become conscious of what we are currently unconscious of? And the truth is, I don't know. You have a lot of work to do. I have a lot of work to do. But I'm willing to do that work. Some of the time is better than nothing never. That is what Good Enough Now is actually about. So again, the texting number now or for the recording is 202-670-4262. But that basically is the starting point. And that's the idea of being able to be responsible for yourself, working with your own working definitions so that you then can figure out not everybody's map looks like yours. Some people center on very different things about themselves than you center on about them. Now we can have a conversation about positive, negative, conscious, and unconscious bias. So with that, I will open it back up and see if there are other thoughts or comments, and get ready for next month about unconscious bias.
Well, Jess, thank you very much. Angela, what do you have any sort of ahas or thoughts, questions that have come to mind here as we kind of bring this in?
No, yeah, I think I'm ready for the next course. I mean, all of this has been helpful to sort of just be thinking about these issues, but I think unfortunately I'm already sort of hyper aware, and I'm in a world where like you just said, we're just doing it some of the time, and I guess I feel a responsibility for more than just my house, and so I want to figure out how then can we all come together so that more than just a couple of us are doing things right some of the time. More of us have got to do right. So but there were some good takeaways, not just identifying, but I think I heard you say no less than 10 times, have a conversation, just have a conversation, talk about it. Like who wants what, why, what is, we can come up with some sort of reason. And I think we forget that a lot. So there were some really good takeaways, but I think just for me, this was very educational. I enjoyed it a lot. And I think it just sort of honed in on the work that we need to do. And that's why I took this class, because I think that we need to do more work.
And I mean, honestly, like Angela, I really feel, I mean, obviously I do this work for a living, right? So what's fascinating though is, and what I would invite, and it usually takes like a couple of hours, like tonight while you're making dinner, right? Is what I would invite you to do is the adventure of the usual suspects that you work with on a daily basis, that are in your family, that are in your Facebook feed. I always say they're the family members that sit near the gravy boat, because then you have to decide between engagement and carbs, right? You know that person, right? I don't want to do this. I don't want to have this conversation with you. So then what is fascinating is I have found help. What has been helpful to me, not easy, but helpful, is even though like my brother and I grew up in the same family, right? Same place, same time, etc. We are so similar in some ways, very funny, work ethic, stunningly gorgeous. He definitely got those scoops. I'm really smart. He's really cute. That worked out. I like to say that I had the opportunity to develop a personality. And we are wildly different in our worldviews. Wildly different. When we start talking about temperament, like I'm such an oldest leader person, and he's such a follower. So now as adults, when I don't have to lead him anywhere, I'm so like thoroughly disgusted at how like throw that man a structure and he is like in it. Doesn't matter that structure is realistic, legal, rational, logical, don't matter. He's in it. He loves a good structure. But a follower needs that, right? I, as a leader, want to explain things, make sense, make things logical, etc., and then like bring more people in, including irrational people who I might be related to. And I don't have that opportunity, right? And so what has been helpful to me, and even when I do this workshop, which I do a lot, what is very helpful for me is, even though like the same box of map colors was used to draw my brother's map and my map, we ended up with very different looking maps.
Mm-hmm.
Like his life taught him this is how to show up. My life taught me that this is how to show up. Even though a lot of that life was shared,
Mm-hmm.
it is still his life and it is still my life. And it allows me, sometimes when it's a little harder, to find grace again. Does it work 100% of the time? Hell no. Does it work more than 0% of the time? Often. Right? So then now I can start working on those kind of burnt bridges or those croutons in my life. And it also gives me some understanding and some empathy, even for like my own kind, when I'm talking to someone who's exhausted, right? Like I can see a little bit more where this exhaustion is coming from, and I can be more empathetic and I can be a better listener.
Yep. I like that a lot.
Excellent. Well, I think on that note, I'm going to say thank you for being here. Thanks for being a part of the conversation today, and I look forward to seeing where the conversation continues as we continue on through the series. So we've got 3 more scheduled conversations at this point, and
May 25th.
Yeah, May 25th. Bring a friend,
Okay.
invite
Yes,
someone, and yeah, because I think Angela, you know, hopefully you'll find some people that who are some of those folks that also could benefit from this message and continue to fan the flames of a healthy, vibrant culture within EDF, and think about how we I'm a big fan of saying, look, we all bring some unique set of gifts and perspectives to the world, and it's useful and helpful and right for us to at least hear each other out. That's a big part of that, being treated with dignity and respect, which I think we all deserve. And so again, thanks for being a part of the conversation today, for asking some great questions, for sharing your perspectives, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thanks for not making this awkward with just one.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you were here. Yeah.
I have enough personality for a whole group.